For the last 5 years, I've had the privilege of offering direction and leadership to Communities of Shalom that was previously based at the General Board of Global Ministries for the first 15 years of its existence. We're now 20 years old, and in the last 5 years based at Drew Theological School in Madison, New Jersey. We're here at General Conference celebrating the 20th anniversary of this General Conference initiative. 20 years ago, the Rodney King verdict came back. CNN yesterday and all the news media made major focus on the Rodney King verdict, where 4 policemen really were acquitted of the crime of excessive battery and force in subduing motorist Rodney King. And that story has been out all day yesterday. What the connection is to us is that that was the spark for Communities of Shalom to begin its work of conflict resolution, of seeking the shalom of the city, as Jeremiah instructs us, to bring health and healing and wholeness and harmony, all that we mean by shalom, to a particular geographical location, which we call shalom zones. So a shalom zone simply is a place, a particular spot in a city, a town, a village, or a rural community where you can demonstrate not just love in action, but shalom in action. How do you raise the quality of life in this particular neighborhood, whether the zone is 1 square block or 4 square blocks or a square mile? This, what began in Los Angeles in the immediate aftermath of the fires in Los Angeles, where 14 different fires, 53 people killed, 6 days of riots, social uprising, devastation, $1 billion worth of property damage. On the heels of that came the first Shalom Zone in South Central Los Angeles. And that became a prototype because of the General Conference's efforts to make that a particular approach to ministry, an approach that looks at assets of a community and not its needs or deficiencies, its strengths. We're chaired by Bishop John Scholl, Bishop of the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference, who for the last 8 years has chaired the National Shalom Committee that oversees this international work. And he'll be making the first statement about the significance of shalom for us.
Great, thank you, Michael. I have had a wonderful journey with Shalom. I came on staff at the General Board of Global Ministries in 1993 and became the director of Communities of Shalom just as we were beginning to initiate the training in Los Angeles. So I've had the opportunity to work with Shalom as a staff person overseeing it. I've also worked in a community where we developed Shalom Zone ministries, and now have had the opportunity to chair Communities of Shalom. The things that I would say that really caught people's imagination early on and still continues today is, number one, the asset-based approach. Too often we look at communities and we look at the problems, we look at the needs, and it's a downward spiral. And so this really begins to say, what are the strengths in the community? What are the assets, and how do we build on those assets? The second is the recognition that the church can't do it all. That the church really needs to be in partnership with community residents, community organizations, corporations in the community, banks, businesses, and so working in partnership. And so that was the second piece that really helped to capture people's imaginations. The third is the training program that was developed, and this training program has continued to develop and has become a very strong training program in the life of the church and also in life of communities. And the whole goal was not just to give people information, but really to get them thinking and working practically on some of the needs and issues in their community and building on the assets. And so by the end of the training, a team would be made up of both church members and community people, and by the end of the training they would have a plan, and that plan would be their initial, might be 6 month, a year, up to 2-year plan that they would begin to work on in their community to begin to address issues. And then the fourth thing that really captured people's imaginations was that it was contextual. So it wasn't like bringing a program in and saying, here's the program, now do this. But it looked at and said, what's happening in this community and what's the appropriate things for the church and the community to be working on. And so a Shalom zone, a community of Shalom, can be very different from neighborhood to neighborhood, community to community, state to state, nation to nation. And so there are no two Shalom sites that are exactly the same because they really grow up out of the community. And so these are the things that have really captured people's imaginations. And as we reported last night, we've trained over 10,000 people in Shalom training, developed over 1,000 different sites. And again, the reason for this is because it really captured people's imagination. The other thing we did not do as a church was put a lot of grant money into Shaloms, so that we did not see this again as a program that we would put grant money into. We really saw this as a leadership development initiative in which we would develop the leadership in the community and also help leadership in the community find and identify local resources. And so we're excited about the future of Shalom and where it's going. We continue to work with new partners all the time that are working with us, and we continue to develop new sites. And so it's very exciting to see the movement continue, not just continue after 20 years, but really launch in some new directions.
I'd like you to meet Joe Salamangue from the Republic of the Congo, because he has served most recently as a Shalom intern, we call Ministers of Shalom, and his assignment has been 6 weeks this past summer in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where we have one of many, many community gardens called Shalom Gardens. And because the inspiration for our Shalom work is really based in Jeremiah 29, seek the peace of the city, seek Shalom of the city, build houses, it says in that scripture, plant gardens and eat what they produce. So it's not just about community development in terms of housing, but it's also planting gardens. And I want to ask him, Joe, what does planting a garden in a Shalom zone have to do with community development?
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. Being a student from the Congo, going to Drew University, my experience last summer in the Shalom zone in Scranton matured my understanding of prophetic ministry and community building. Shalom Scranton does three things. There's a community garden. There's an after-school program for children, and they also work with refugees. But building the garden is the central activity because it helps develop relationships. Number one, the Loris Community Garden is a prophetic imagination in the sense that the place where it is situated actually belonged to a lady called Lori. She owned that house, and the house burnt, and she died in the house as it burnt. And so we had free land of bad memory. What could we do with a free land of bad memory? We thought of it as an asset for community garden. And today, the Loris Community Garden does a lot of things to that community. Number one, it provides food for the community and green food. Number two, it brings people together and it allows conversation. People talk about their failures and their successes. And so as a result of that, some people begin to think of solving the conflict at the community garden. Number three, it also allows children in that community to be exposed to other races, to other classes, and make friends at that level and have a conversation. And so people begin to identify with one another and consider one's problems as a community problem. I might stop there for the sake of time, but in general, that's what the community garden does. Thank you.
Pastor, before Bishop Sprague was bishop, he was Pastor Joseph Sprague from Ohio. 20 years ago, at the 1992 General Conference in Louisville. And when he was, as a local pastor, involved in many, many years of justice organizing and peace and justice work, when he heard on the floor of the General Conference that there was fires in LA. Of course, we were all following that story wherever we were. But I'd like to ask him what he did 20 years ago that for us is the inspiration for communities of Shalom today. What sparked his interest and his passion, and why 20 years later are you still doing Shalom work and still involved in a Shalom zone in Columbus, Ohio?
Thank you. 20 years ago, my fear was that hearing the story, that we would do a rather typical United Methodist response. That is an eloquent resolution, full of rhetoric, but absent action plans. That we would talk and leave feeling that we had done a good thing, instead of having concrete plans for how we might address not only the situation in LA, but the urban crisis that was there for anyone to see who would open her or his eyes. And so the language of Shalom came as a result of, on the one hand, knowledge I had of enterprise zones, which were extant at that time as a governmental program. My perception was and is that they were too narrow and that they focused only on economics. And what we really needed was a more holistic approach. And so in searching the scriptures, the Jeremiah passage and other passages about Shalom, the welfare, the well-being of the community jumped out. And as a result of that, I fashioned late at night the essence of what became the motion the next day, but it was not my community that was on fire, it was LA. So I went to meet with the LA people very early that next morning. Jim Lawson, having been a longtime friend and colleague, made that easy. And as a result, with the LA people, particularly with Jim Lawson, we agreed to the language and to the concept, then farmed it out a bit to a few other persons that we thought would be essential if indeed, A, it would be passed, and B, if it would be implemented. And you may be aware that by a huge margin, nearly unanimously, the Shalom motion passed, and we were able to move into action pretty quickly. Now, having said that, 20 years later, I find myself back at the beginning. What goes around comes around. In retirement as a bishop, I've returned to the grassroots. I'm not a meeting attender anymore. In fact, I'm out of hibernation to even be here these 2 days because I've been spending my time either on the streets or in 3 prisons in Ohio. And the streets where I've spent time over the last year and a half are back in Columbus, where we now live, in an area called the Hilltop, which if it were separated from the rest of political Columbus, which is the largest city in Ohio, would be the 8th largest city in Ohio, 66,000 people. There's no supermarket on the west side. It is a food desert. There are 6 gangs, very active. Murders, drive-bys are standard fare. One of our elementary schools with which we now work closely has 22 languages spoken there. So with 8 small, struggling, typical urban United Methodist churches in that area, which congregations over the years had done some wonderful things, including a marvelous free store, felt that they had hit a wall, that they'd reached a flat plateau. And so they asked if I would be willing to consult with them, to kind of come to the community and work with them, not so much originally to create a Shalom zone, but what might we do together? And in moving into that community as an outsider, a Columbus resident, but an outsider, I employed a pretty traditional community organizing model of simply listening, first within the congregations, United Methodist and then ecumenical, and then I asked clergy and lay leaders from the congregations to take me to the stakeholders in the community. And I basically asked 2 questions. What are the issues in this community that from your perspective and the perspective of those with whom you live and work need to be addressed? And what assets, what strengths do you, organizationally or individually, bring to the table that, if networked with others, might impact the issues identified? In the midst of that, as I was playing the information that we were gathering back to the clergy and laity who were gathering, I was surprised by grace. I was surprised by the movement of the Spirit, because what I discovered after almost a half a century of urban work was and is that I never experienced the kind of openness to cooperation, the kind of willingness to network that I experienced. From the police to the universities, to social service agencies, to would-be funders, people were saying our system, the police chief said, in what was to be a half-hour interview that turned out to be a 2.5-hour conversation, we can't do it alone. We simply cannot deal with the violence, which was the number one issue that the neighborhood people with whom I talked identified. We can't deal with it alone. It's epidemic. We cannot deal with it alone. We need help. We must have help. The school superintendent, wonderful Southern Baptist African-American woman who had come out of the system, said, we can't do it alone. One of these schools, 22 languages. Our Somalians who come, many of the youngsters have never seen indoor plumbing. How do we expect our teachers to teach in a context? Point being a willingness. And so we began to open a table on a regular basis. Come, let us pray together, let us reason together, let us talk together. Right away, we went to the Literacy Council. Everybody's saying we need to deal with the literacy issue. The Literacy Council said, we have one little council in the library. You want a couple more? Give a spot. 2 of our churches said, okay. Public schools said, we need help with ESL. English is a second language, not just with students, but particularly with those moms who are forced to stay at home oftentimes and isolated. That began to happen. Long story made short, after 18 months, and these statistics are absolutely mind-boggling, at least to me. After 18 months, there's an after-school teen program in a little tiny United Methodist Church building where 175 at-risk children gather almost daily. In the first month that center was open, and it was open in a very kind of relational, come let us learn to know each other together kind of way, one young woman, 14 years of age with her own child, broke into the church building an hour before the session was to start. Why? She said, this is the only safe place in my life for me and for my child. And that has now become just an integral part of the community, with now, in cooperation with the public schools, a virtual high school in that building. Public schools put a full-time teacher in there, a bank of 20 computers, their software. GED gets you nothing today. So this program gets youngsters a diploma. They have to pass the test, gets them a diploma. The Children's Defense Fund, oh my God, that the United Methodist Church would partner with the Children's Defense Fund when we have 16.4 million poor kids in this nation, 8.3 million kids without health care. Half of the kids in this nation do not read and cannot compute at grade levels 4, 8, and 12. Children's Defense Fund knows how to deal with this. They came to us and said, do you remember Freedom Schools? I said, yeah, I remember. I was at Freedom Summer in Mississippi. I remember Freedom Schools. Well, we have a new model. It's teaching youngsters to learn to love to read. Because if a black boy cannot read at grade level, at grade 3, he's in the pipeline to prison. If he's Hispanic, 1 in 6. If he's poor white, 1 in 13. So we went to the public schools. I went to my good friend, the superintendent, and said, Dr. Harris, what do you think? She said, which schools do you want? You don't have to use church buildings for that. We'll open our school buildings. 3 school buildings were opened free of charge. We had 150 kids in Freedom Schools last summer, and the mentors were servant leaders, college-age students, indigenous to the community. We paid them $2,700 each per year so they could go to college on their own dollar that they had earned. This year there will be 4 of those schools, one of them a junior high, and When Freedom School stops at 3 o'clock, our teen center will be in this building, which not only has all of the resources of the school with a gym, et cetera, but a huge community garden where the kids are being taught how to go on and on and on it goes. And now we have, in cooperation with the Ohio State University, a free medical clinic, a legal clinic in cooperation with Capital University. There's a peace and mediation center where kids are being taught to be peer nonviolence interventionists. What I'm trying to say is the Spirit is active out there. If we have the guts and the wherewithal to get out there and get with them and are willing to get our hands dirty. The police and firemen, now let me stop, I'll do this one because this is beautiful. Police and firemen said, we don't know how to do community policing anymore. 6 gangs, blah, blah, blah. We said, what if we opened the Buckeye Ranch, which had a pristine gym, that they closed down at 3:30 when their school was out. What if we opened that to the community? Would you police and firemen be mentors and coaches? Take off your uniforms and get down and dirty with the kids? Started 1 night a week. It's now 4, and the women and young women in the community are saying, we want our night. These are mostly Hispanic young men who are eligible for interscholastic athletics because they've been in trouble. Point I'm trying to make is Shalom is on the loose. It's not about church playing church. It's about church being willing to get in the way of the Spirit. I learned a long time ago that you can get anything done if you don't care who gets the credit. And this is not about the church getting credit. It's about the church being a catalyst for the Spirit to bring shalom in a terribly, terribly troubled neighborhood. Sorry for the elongation.
We want to give you a chance to ask some questions, because what we're offering the church and the denomination, the connection, is Shalom Zone training, which is a 7-session series on how to do this work that you've been hearing about, how to build houses to live in them, how to plant gardens and eat what they produce, how to transform the world one community at a time. It's a systematic approach, and it takes a 40-hour commitment from a Shalom team or teams to commit to this kind of training process, that you can learn how to do community organizing. You can learn how to strengthen multicultural relationships. You can learn how to put love into action. You can learn to ask the deeper questions, not just let's feed these kids that are hungry, but why are these people hungry? Not just give a fish to someone or teach people how to fish, but to say, well, how do we get the people who live by the lake access to the resources of the lake and get the no fishing signs taken down? So I'd like you to ask some questions about our training product, Shalom Zone training, or anything you've heard. I know Bishop Scholl has to go in a moment, and we're here to answer your questions.
At this point, we'll open it up to questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Just give your name and who you're reporting for.
Linda Bloom, United Methodist News Service. And this is to anybody who was there in 1992 at General Conference. Is what has happened in the 20 years since, is that something that you expected to happen? Are you is this at the point where it really is fulfilling what you were hoping would occur when that resolution was crafted and approved?
Well, I'll start with that, and I know some others will jump in. Initially, we didn't know what all to expect. The initial was really a response to what was happening in Los Angeles, and the initial response was to address some of the immediate needs. I mean, there were people that didn't have homes, there were businesses that were badly damaged, there was a number of things, and so the initial was really response. But from there, we said we need to become now proactive, and how do we begin to work to address the systemic issues so that we can prevent these types of things happening in the future. What clearly we didn't anticipate was the way it would take off, and the numerous requests that we would get to come into communities, come into annual conferences, even go to other countries to begin to help the Shalom concept develop there. Certainly, we have seen great change in a number of communities. And, you know, I'll be the first to say that it hasn't been even all throughout.
Right.
But you just never know what's going to happen when you go into a community. I remember working with one community in South Carolina in which they had 6 people. And we say that you have to have 8 people from your church and community to participate in the training so that they participate as a team. And we generally train 3 to 5 teams at a time. This church only had 6 people. And the whole time, they never really got it until about the next to the last training. And they said, you know, we've been going about this all wrong. We didn't understand. What can we do? And so we worked with them. And my goodness, they went back and organized their community and leveraged $30 million for economic development work in their community. And it began with 6 church people who caught the vision really at the very last minute, if you will, and saw the possibility, went back, and they started with a picnic and hot dogs to get the neighborhood to come together to talk about the community and people working together to do something. And through that, they got business people, residents, and then they began to work in their community. And as I said, they leveraged $30 million for economic development work in their community. You just never know what's going to happen. The Spirit will move, and the training has been such an integral part in helping the Spirit to move into people's lives. Thank you.
I would add to that by saying I think there's, to your question, kind of good news, bad news, good news. The good news John has referred to in terms of those immediate responses, the repair of a lot of brokenness, great energy, enthusiasm, so forth. Then a period of hiatus for any number of reasons, partly culturally driven, I think partly denominationally driven. We weren't for a while terribly engaged with the city as a denomination. We were more in retreat than in ministry. And that hit Shalom along with other things. And many of our urban congregations and our urban pastors in particular in retreat were just simply trying to keep the doors open. Almost in a frantic stage, if you please. The good news, though, is I think there's been an amazing recovery. And that recovery is driven by the Spirit, which is blowing where it will, and by the openness of other systems, private, public, etc., to come to the table if they are invited. And the fact that we are seeing a new kind of young leadership that does not want to play church, but wants to serve Jesus Christ in the world. And when those young persons are given opportunity and training and support to be out there in the trenches, they can and are doing amazing things. All the stuff I just described is being led by 2 part-time staff persons, one of whom is 29, the other one is 31.
Is there another question?
You may be interested in knowing that we are here on Tuesday to offer Shalom Zone training as a demonstration of the 7 sessions. And we'll be in the park, and we'll be at Hyde United Methodist Church nearby. And Minister Annie Allen, who is in charge of our training, coordinator of Shalom Zone training, is giving leadership to that.
I would like to say a few words about our training product. We have a 42-hour training program. As Bishop Sprague said earlier, the notions of multicultural, multi-faith collaborations, the idea of tapping into local assets, the idea of working for systemic change captures the imagination of many local churches and local communities. And many local churches and local communities don't know how to engage across racial lines, across class, across cultures. Many don't know that there are dozens of methods to community organizing. there are many methods to organizing, to planning. Do you do strategic planning? Do you do visioning? How do you organize your board of directors? How do you develop organizationally? So the training gives participants the nuts and bolts to do community work on the ground. We always talk about asset-based community development. Well, how do you actually create an asset map? And how do you continually add to your assets in the community? How do you put all of that into a plan that can be implemented using the partnerships that you build along the way through your organizing? So the training program gives the nuts and bolts to the concepts that have captured the imagination, that have developed in communities over the last 20 years. What's new about Shalom is that we now engage in state-of-the-art teaching, interactive teaching techniques. We use video and PowerPoints and music and art and all sorts of mediums for people to engage in team building, in developing their work, as well as an online version for those who need our young generation will be online. And they will be organizing through Twitter and through Facebook and through many other forums. So we have an online version of training as well to engage young people and to engage and to better utilize our own resources as well. So I invite all of you to participate in our 1.5 hour snapshot, a little mini training by Communities of Shalom, again tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock at Hyde Park Community Methodist Church.
And the Shalom Zone training is not simply offered by Drew University's Shalom Resource Center. That's where this is the international movement's headquarters at Drew University, and we have developed the training there and redeveloped it over the years. But it's also now being licensed for use by other institutions, colleges and universities and seminaries. United Theological Seminary, for example, will start using it this fall. Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, has already signed an agreement with Drew University to use the approach of Shalom in their curriculum. Dr. Robert Duncan is here, president of Bacone College, to say a word about why they, as American Baptist College, want Shalom training.
Bacone has a wonderful history of working with Native people since 1880, and one of our regular partners is the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, and as president I've been pleased to provide and confer degrees to both David Wilson, the general superintendent for the conference, and Anita Phillips, the coordinator for the Native American Comprehensive Plan. And part of that cooperation has been looking to see how we can revitalize a faith component in all that we do at Bacone College. So we've licensed 2 agreements with Drew University and the Communities of Shalom. The first is to use the Communities of Shalom product, the training, with our athletic program to work with churches in the community to bring about transformative change along the lines of racial justice in Muskogee, Oklahoma, as part of our athletic program's Champions of Character, which is a component of the NAIA, which is our athletic conference. The second thing we're doing is licensing the product to use within our Christian ministry degree as a concentration, a community developer concentration in our bachelor's in Christian ministry. We offer that online as degree completion, and we'll also be hosting the continuing education portion for Drew as they offer this training. Bacone will be hosting the continuing ed piece of that. So it's a nice cooperative relationship. Both the American Baptist Churches USA and the United Methodist Church have long histories of social justice, and I'm pleased to be a United Methodist pastor from Greater New Jersey serving the American Baptists in Oklahoma. So it's a nice way to bring, as Bacone's image is, the medicine wheel, to bring that circle together. And honor all of the relationships that have been part of this wonderful journey in getting to know about Shalom.